All right. Hi, Daryl. Thanks for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me.
So, I want to first talk about inflation. So, we got the CPI print today. It's the lowest since February 2021. But of course, there's still kind of concerning trends in inflation regarding shelter. So, can you talk about how these inflation trends are impacting how policymakers could address housing affordability?
Yes, shelter inflation has been a sticking point within overall inflation. And the issue is that there's lots of different ways to measure shelter inflation. And the way that the Fed measures it, or the measure that they use, is a bit lagged. It's an index, it's based on surveys and other data. But the data that we've been looking at Redfin shows that home price growth is decelerating. And also rents have been stable for basically the last 2 years. They really have been quite tepid in terms of growth. There's some places where rents are going up more than others, but that's a more localized problem. It's not a driver, at least the way we see it. But the way that the Fed measures it is that they'll ask homeowners things like, how much would you be willing to rent your house out for? How much do you think you could get in rent? And because many homeowners are locked in with their mortgage rates, it does take a lot of money for them to be willing to rent it out. And I think that's what's contributing more to this overall inflation picture right now. It's kind of a lagged effect. But in terms of new construction home prices or rents, those are pretty stable. So I don't think it is something the Fed should be concerned about or even could control through monetary policy.
Yeah. Yeah. Monetary policy is such a blunt tool to try and fix the housing problem. The Fed also can't control the weather. And so we have had two massive hurricanes. And there was a survey out of Redfin that said that the damage from these hurricanes has led to 32% of young adults rethinking their relocation plans. So can you talk about sort of this shift in perspectives on housing and if it'll have maybe lasting impacts on housing trends, especially in these areas that might be vulnerable to climate change?
The natural disasters that have occurred have been quite severe, especially in places like Asheville. And we don't have numbers yet on how many homes have been destroyed, but it seems like it was pretty significant. About 15% of homes in that area did have severe flood risk. We measure that using First Street Foundation data. It's on our website at the property level, so we can measure those kinds of things. So this place did have high flood risk. It was a very unusual storm, but because of climate risk, they'll probably have more storms going forward, and not just there, in other places as well. So this is going to be a problem. One thing I think that people should think about when they're buying a home is not just whether their individual home is insulated from the elements, but whether their community is prepared. Because what we saw in Asheville is that the infrastructure matters so much. If your home survives, it's not really worth that much if you can't get on the road and get to your groceries, get to your gas. So I think that's something people should also pay attention to, how well prepared their locality is for climate change.
Yeah. Yeah. Like the infrastructure that supports all of these things. Yeah. And, you talked a little bit about the flood risk that happens, and flood insurance is something that you have to buy separately than property insurance. And so can you talk about how you see insurance companies maybe responding to these climate problems and what that could do to housing affordability? Like, insurers have basically pulled out of Florida entirely. So what do you see happening there?
I think that real estate is one of the first places that we'll see the financial impacts of climate change. It will come directly through insurance because the calculation for your insurance premium is basically the likelihood that you will have a claim times the cost of that claim. So insurers, when they're looking at the likelihood, they're going to take into account weather patterns if they can. In places like California, they have rules around what insurers can take into account. And that causes other problems like a lack of coverage. Because insurers, if they can't afford to cover somebody, they're just going to deny them coverage. So both things are going to be an issue for people. Either people's insurance premiums are going to go up, and that includes both the primary home insurance and the flood insurance, which is supplemental. And another thing that could happen is that if you're denied insurance altogether, that would severely negatively impact the value of your home. Because if buyers can't get insurance, they can't get a mortgage. And if you can't get a mortgage, that really limits who can buy your home, the demand for your home, and it's going to impact the overall value.
Yeah, yeah. Because if somebody can't live there, obviously the price is going to have to go down until somebody can self-insure, right? Like that's sort of the alternative if you're not able to get a private insurer. Is that correct?
Yes, and we see different examples of this. I think there are the people who are wealthy enough where they can self-insure if something disastrous happened, they would be able to rebuild on their own. And there are other people whose plan would just be essentially to abandon the home, sell it for whatever the land value is, and move on. And we're hearing more of that, of people doing that, especially in Florida, where insurance has gone up the most out of any state.
Yeah. And, we talk a lot about the housing crisis, but I'm a renter, as are many other people. So could you talk about, the renters market and if that's in a crisis in the same way that housing is?
Yes, rents have been pretty stable. They had a big increase during the pandemic when people were moving around, and it was just a lot of disruption in the rental market at that time, and that caused an increase in demand, increase in households forming, and that pushed up rents. But since around 2022, rents have pretty much stabilized. There are still some local differences, but for the most part, people have seen rents be flat. And at the same time, in the housing market, mortgage rates have gone up so much, more people have gone to the rental market. So there's more demand, but the reason that rents haven't gone up is because there's actually more supply. There's been more new construction of smaller units, especially studios and one-bedroom apartments, and that's what's helped keep rents stable.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of people will say that maybe housing isn't the American dream anymore, that renting might be more economically favorable. Could you talk about that trade-off? Like when you look at the housing market and are thinking about, what young people should do, should they consider buying a house? Should they consider renting, just from an economic perspective?
You're buying a home in America, we call it the American dream. It's such a visceral thing. It's such an emotional thing. People associate it with making that, I guess, upper middle class lifestyle work for them. And I think that's why it's so hard for people to consider renting as an alternative. There is this prestige that comes with being a homeowner, or even a property owner in general, that really goes back to this country's founding. And I think that's why it still is aspirational. I think people will always want to be homeowners, but more people are coming to the conclusion, at least from a financial perspective, that they'd be better off renting. In general, it's better to rent if you are going to be moving in under 5 years, because rental or real estate fees are high. And that means that if you want to make a profit off of selling your home, you have to wait a long time to have enough appreciation to offset those fees. So if you're going to be moving a lot, then it's better to rent, especially if you're young and you want to keep your career options open. It can be advantageous to move a lot. So I think that there are definitely reasons to be a renter. You really have to look at your own personal situation. And also there are differences on the local level in terms of the cost of owning versus renting. Like renting is much more expensive in Detroit than owning a home. So that may be a place where homeownership makes more sense, but then it can also be more work and you might not have as much appreciation in your home value. That's one of the reasons that there is that trade-off in Detroit. So I think there's a lot to consider in terms of your goals, how you want to build wealth. If you are going to rent, my advice is to make sure you keep saving and keep putting money, ideally in something like a diversified index fund, so you can still build wealth.
Yeah. Outside of like the homeownership equity. Yeah.
Yes.
And so we have an election in about a month. And of course, both candidates have different housing policy plans. Could you talk through the difference between the two?
They're very, very different. It's kind of like difficult to compare and contrast them just because of how contrasting they are. I'll start with the things that they have in similar, which are pretty limited, but they both talked about freeing up federal land to build housing on. When Trump talks about freeing up federal land, I think he's mostly talking about more rural land. He talked about that in Nevada in particular, where there is a lot of federal land. And I think when Harris talks about it, she's probably more talking about putting apartment buildings on top of post offices in dense urban centers. I don't think either is going to solve the housing crisis. They might help. I think that additional housing supply is always a good thing. Putting it out in the exurbs can create more sprawl, so I would prefer to see it prioritized in urban areas, but the land abundance is not there in the urban areas either. So I think those are both small things that they have in common. In terms of the differences, Harris has spoken a lot about building enough housing to solve the housing shortage, essentially. She wants to build 3 million homes Unclear if that's 3 million on top of what would have already been built or just 3 million, but 3 million is the number she put out there. And Freddie Mac estimates the housing shortage to be 4 million homes. So it seems like she really wants to take a big swing at that. And she wants to accomplish that through subsidies for builders, subsidies to first-time homebuyers, down payment assistance, essentially, and getting the red tape and zoning regulations out of the way at the local level. I think that is the most important thing to focus on, but it's also the hardest thing to accomplish at the federal level. She's talked about mostly using carrots, and I think some housing advocates would argue that there need to be more sticks. But at the same time, I think it's great that a leader is aligning under this YIMBY message, because at the very least, it should allow Democrats to coalesce around this issue. We've already seen a lot of progress in California. I think it's going to be harder and harder for local Democrat mayors to be NIMBYs if the governor and the president are coming out with these YIMBY policies. On the Trump side, he's said some NIMBY things. He said that he wants to keep low-income housing out of the suburbs. It's literally on his Agenda 47 website to do that. And I think that that is antithetical to YIMBYism, to block dense, affordable housing, even if it, no matter who it's for, whether it's for low-income people or middle-income people. In his last term, he did opportunity zones, which I think could be considered a real estate policy, but we really haven't seen any significant impacts from that policy. So unclear if he would, do that again. He hasn't mentioned it in this term. I'm trying to think what else he's talked about. Oh, of course, immigration. He has said that, or at least JD Vance has said that the millions of immigrants are the reason that housing costs are high, and deporting them would bring down housing costs, which I think is in a very extreme position that I do not support.
Yeah, it's also factually inaccurate. And so could you talk a little... but could you talk about the carrots and the sticks, right? So when we think about housing, it is really amazing that we have a candidate who is supporting NIMBYism, because housing is probably the biggest problem that we're facing. And when you talk about these incentive models, carrots versus sticks, what does that look like when applied to housing policy?
Well, it's basically either giving money or taking it away. The way that Harris has framed it, it's giving grants, I believe, at a local level. But some people have argued that funding should be withheld from services that the federal government provides. They've done this for the legal drinking age, for example. They were going to withhold transportation funding if states didn't adopt a 21-year drinking age, and they could do something similar for zoning laws. If you don't eliminate single family zoning at the state level, which has been done, it's done in California, essentially, then you would get your funding withheld.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I feel like that would be definitely effective. So the final question that I have is about your book. So you have a new book coming out called Hate the Game. What is it about, and when is it available for purchase?
So the subtitle is Economic Cheat Codes for Life, Love, and Work. It's essentially it's like Lean In meets Freakonomics. If Lean In were written from an economist's brain with all of the research attached to it, then that would be my book. But it's obviously written by me, so it involves my experience as an economist. I was an economist at a large tech company, which I left out of the book, so I'm not going to name it here. But I was an economist for a large tech company for 2 years before I went on to Redfin, and I talk about those experiences and how I navigated the business world using economic theory and economic research. So that's the book. And it comes out April 11th.
Oh, so soon. And is it available for pre-order yet?
Yes, it's available for pre-order, hatethegamebook.com.
Oh, beautiful. Awesome. Well, it sounds very interesting. Sounds very useful. I know people can follow you on Twitter. Where else can people find your work?
Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. I'm all over the place. I also write for Forbes if you want to see some of my past writings.
Awesome. Thank you, Daryl.